Putting the Pieces Together with Jigsaw Learning focuses on stories from the field as leaders implement collaborative response. Join us every month as we invite our partners to share how they are meeting the diverse needs of students with the integral understanding that every child deserves a team.
Welcome back to another episode of Putting the Pieces Together with Jigsaw Learning. Kurtis, Lorna, and I are joined today by Trevor van Someren and Aaron Weimer from Clear Vista School in Westaskiwin Regional Public Schools. So hi guys, nice to see you.
Hello.
Hi, good to see you.
Hey, Trevor.
Hi, Trevor and Aaron.
Hey, Aaron.
So I don't know who wants to jump in on this and share the background, but I hear some stories about three-piece suits coming from your guys' school.
Three-piece suits, hey? At times, when the time is right, sometimes you gotta dress for success for sure. But I have been known. I like a Cliff Barnes style suit from Dallas. But yeah, it's not every day. Actually, most days I would say probably I don't wear a tie anymore, and Aaron's not typically one for a tie. But yeah, you want to put your best foot forward for sure.
That always struck me, Trevor, when we come to these days and you'd look over and, oh my goodness, I thought I kind of dressed appropriately for the day, but this guy is the most well-dressed person in the room.
He's a little jealous of your closet.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't even know. Yeah, I own one three-piece suit. So I've only worn it a couple of times, so I feel like it's I've got Trevor to tone it down just a little bit.
You got to meet in the middle.
Balance,
Yeah.
balance.
There's been no Hawaiian shirts worn by me though, as Aaron likes to wear.
So we've been trying to put out a question here to a number of our guests that we've been bringing on in our most recent episodes, and that is, if you had to describe collaborative response to a colleague that's unfamiliar with the work, what would you say? How would you go about describing that to another principal who's hasn't really engaged in learning or understanding collaborative response?
Sure. Yeah. I would say collaborative response is a blend together of responding through intervention and professional learning communities. And the puzzle piece mentality where the pieces are coming together, but they're not standalone. They interlocked and overlap with each other, where you've got staff working together. They're talking about consistency in what their tier one instruction is, combined with, the real shift to tiering responses in terms of, you're tiering your responses. You're not tiering students, individual students. It's kind of, an efficient, structured way at looking at supporting students and keeping students right at the heart. I think is kind of why collaborative responses has been such an impactful process.
Aaron, is there anything that you would add to that if you were trying to describe that to a colleague?
Well, and for me, I think the biggest benefit is the structure it provides in terms of when you're going to have certain discussions. So one of the things that when I first got into like public education was you go into a classroom, and I started at a rural school, and there was no real way to support each other or even get resources from other teachers or learn what best practices even are. It's like you're starting all over again. And every time you start a new course, it was the same thing, which teaching has been around for a long time. There's lots of information there we should be sharing. And it provides a structure of, okay, so during these meetings, this is when we're going to talk about best pedagogy in terms of what's happening in the classroom. During these meetings, then we're going to focus on students and what we need to do to support them. And then in these meetings, we're going to talk about students who require that extra support, those kids that you usually end up talking about for hours and hours every week. Well, we're not going to have those meetings every week with this group of people. It's focused, it's here. We're going to come up with a plan, and then we're going to see how that plan works. And then we're not going to rehash everything a second or third time through just because it's the easiest conversation to have, right? It's easy to talk about that one student who has all of the barriers as opposed to those students who have some barriers, but they seem to be doing okay. So I really appreciate the structure and even like the templating of like meeting structure. This is when we're going to talk about celebrations. This is where we're going to talk about our first issue. And these are the kids that we want to address and find a way to get them to meet that learning outcome. So the structure piece has been great. Because for professional learning communities, I feel like We've been doing professional learning communities as an organization for a while, and the structure that collaborative response provides kind of gets those meetings from sometimes they'd be spinning their wheels, right? You weren't sure what the purpose of the conversation was. This way, you're not spinning your wheels with that conversation.
Yeah, I love that, Aaron, that idea of clearly defining each of the teams that you have in your school and what their purpose is, so that we can make sure that we're meeting the needs of all of our kids across the building, but also that every team that comes together knows exactly what it is that we're doing when we come together, and how we're going to move through using those processes too.
In terms of directing staff as well, like there'll be that impromptu conversation in the hallway, and there'll be a teacher who's like, this kid, they've been driving me nuts for weeks. I'm like, have you recommended them to our student support team meeting? No. I'm like, you should probably do that, because then we're going to have a full 45 minutes for that kid, and we know exactly what that meeting's about. It's going to be about that kid, and we all know going in, as opposed to that kid kind of taking over the meeting and 3 people being there saying, well, I don't even see that kid. I don't, right? So it really helps focus when that dedicated time is happening. So for us, I think that's been one of the big successes for collaborative response.
Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, like I would say, we had a lot of, I don't want to say false starts, but a lot of things where we would try and incorporate where staff were saying, we want to be involved. We don't want to feel left out of the loop in terms of supporting student needs. And so the year before that we brought in the collaborative response model, we had moved to bringing our whole team together. And at the time we were calling them student support team meetings, and we'd get together after school, and we'd try and everybody problem solve on 1 or 2, really high needs students. And man, we're banging our heads against the wall, because it ends up becoming not positive, not productive. When you can pull that into a student support team meeting, as we call it now, and we hit that every day 3 is when we have it before school, and teachers can refer in and slide in before class even starts, but we're not asking them to come in at 6:30 in the morning, right? And they're able to access your family school liaison worker, your Indigenous support worker, principal, vice principal, inclusion coach, your reading specialist within the school, and you can really focus and problem solve together and try some things, and then maybe bring that back and check in and see how it goes. It gives an opportunity to free up when you get to that collaborative team meeting and you've got everybody together. You can actually look at setting some attainable goals in a safe environment where people are free to kind of take some risks. So that has been an absolute game changer, the structure that's been provided there.
Setting that dedicated time that everyone knows when it's happening, and that they can bring forward students, and being able to access those additional supports that you have in your school. That's huge, because otherwise you do have teachers just trying to problem solve on their own, not really sure about, who can actually help me with this. But really being clear about those structures is really important for teachers and for their well-being, but also for the success of our students too.
So Aaron, you've talked about clearly defining the different teams and their purpose. And Trevor, you started to talk about some of the structures, like your school support team meeting every day 3 at 8:15. What are the other structures in your school around the layers of teams? Who's at them? When do they happen? That kind of thing.
We piggybacked right off the collaborative response model. We were looking for consistency across our schools in our district, and both Aaron and myself were part of, as our leadership team, we were part of the original collaborative response guiding coalition. So this has been an area of excitement for both of us to try and implement and stay as close to the model as we can in terms of the structure. So we have student support team meetings, as I mentioned, on day 3s. We rotate. We're a larger K-8 school within the context of our division, kind of an average size school within, what would be a bigger city setting. But we have 2 teachers at each grade, basically from kindergarten all the way up to grade 8. So we have collaborative team meetings. We've got a kindergarten to grade 2 group. They will end up meeting basically once every 4 to weeks. We have a grade 3-4 collaborative team. They will meet, same deal, just kind of rotates. It's typically Thursdays after school. Aaron and I are at all of those and we rotate through. So every Thursday after school, we know we've got that meeting set on the calendar. We've got a 5-6 team and then we have a 7-8 team. And so as part of those teams would be the 2 homeroom teachers, the education assistant or assistants that are also part of that team. And then we would also have our inclusion coach that would also be part of that team. Most of our collaborative team meetings are academic focused. We've really made a shift to moving so that we're really either numeracy or literacy focused. And that's typically known in advance. We've got a data piece that we're looking at that's known and decided where we're using that to try and drive the discussion. That's been our shift that we've been really trying to make this year. So that's the collaborative team meetings. We also have collaborative planning meetings. Now, those are just for the grade partners. Aaron and I, honestly, we're not really at those. We're aware of them. We have been invited to take part in them. Those are kind of take place within the span of the 2 grade partner schedules, whether it's before, after school, whatever works for them. In the span of 2 weeks, they would have met 45 minutes, and they are working on, whether it's common formative assessments or they're co-planning together, and they share back those collaborative planning things that's incorporated. They share that back at our regular collaborative team meetings. And so in the span of that collaborative team meeting, we also have a spot within it where we can also name, hey, actually, we do have a student that's in red. We're going to flag that, and we want to have that student get picked up at our next student support team meeting. Case consult meetings don't happen super frequently at Clear Vista. Those are typically where we would bring in, typically one of our director team members, whether it would be Jody Mattia or Christian Holpe coming in, and we need some division support for that. Those would be kind of more on a tier 4 basis, where we've got a student that's really emergent, whether it might be a crisis concern or, we're needing support from educational psych assessment or something along those lines. In order for us to access that within our district, we have to have talked about it at a school level at a student support team meeting, which for us, we have them, once a week for sure. Sometimes it's even working out to twice a week where we're meeting on a student support team level. So those are kind of the basic levels and kind of structure for how we're meeting them. What we have been shifting to a little bit this year is we've been having kind of moving some of those Thursday afternoon meetings. We've actually ended up sliding some of them onto our professional learning days, where whether it would be weather factors or sickness or whatever it might be, where you've got multiple members of the team is absent, you have to be flexible to say, you know what, doesn't make sense to meet today. It is important that we meet, but we're going to just pick this up on a professional learning day instead. And
we had great plans in September, but the nice thing is we've been able to change and modify those plans as the year has gone on. And collaborative response is flexible enough that you can do that, right? So we were hoping to have meetings every Thursday, and then as we started seeing all those, we have leadership team meetings on Thursdays, so that's not always going to work because we might not be back in time. And then, so knowing at least what the fact that we know what the meeting is going to be about, and that teachers are kind of informed on this is going to be our area of focus for that 45 minutes. If it gets pushed back a week or whatever, it's fine. Like the meetings are still, we want the meetings to be effective, and we want teachers to know that their time is being valued when we're engaged in that process. So that's been the part that we've really been working on this year, is making sure that we're keeping teachers engaged in that their time is being usefully used, right? That they're getting value out of the meetings. And so even as they start are deciding what their actions are going to be, what their measures are going to be, following up and saying, okay, so is this really what we're going to be doing? Even like a week or 2 weeks before we have that next CTM meeting, we want to check in and say, okay, so this is what you said you were going to do. Have you been able to try it? Is it effective? Is it something can you speak it to it next meeting, right? So that others can hear whether or not what you said was successful or not successful.
I really like what you've described too, of your involvement as administrators intensifies as the conversation about the student intensifies, that, we can set up some structures and help help put some expectations for the collaborative planning time, but we're not going to be there to dictate or manage that conversation. But when we get to those escalating conversations, we're going to be deeply involved as administrators, because it's going to take some further coordination and supports that go beyond the classroom. I think that's really the power of those layering of teams, is again, understanding each has a different purpose, our involvement shifts and changes, and the intensity about a student increases as we move through those layers.
And I think what I've learned through this process is our role as administrators is really to be supportive and to provide resources. So I can't fix every problem myself. There's probably too many problems, and I'm not in the classroom anymore. And so learning to step back and be like, okay, so this is an issue with a student. This is what we want to do to try and support them. How can I help you support the student in the classroom?
Yeah.
Right? As opposed to,
rather than that handoff.
Yeah, as opposed to, okay, I'm going to take the kid back to the office. We'll hang out for a little bit. I'll help them with, a subject, and because you can't do that for that's 2-3 kids. We need to support more than just 2 or 3 kids by ourselves, right? So that's been a learning process for me, is being able to let go of that. I get directly seeing how a student's doing and saying, okay, this is how can I help you support the student, and how are you going to let me know that it's working or not working?
And you know what, Aaron, that really speaks to empowering your teachers, that you're turning things back to them. You're supporting them, but you're turning things back to the teachers so that they can be empowered to do the work with that student, but with others as well.
One of the the areas that we're still working on, and I don't know, maybe we've been struggling a little bit, is exactly with what Aaron's talking about, is trying to build that continuum of supports so that it is kind of a shared ownership. So it's not, I'm bringing a student forward for you to solve the problem for me, to be the support, as opposed to, when you have those really good discussions and you're able to name some key issues and you start getting people to pull things together, like, wait a second, I think we have actually solved some problems where a student is struggling with number sense. We've solved some of these problems where a student is struggling with attendance or connection, right? So what were some of the things we tried on that? Because we've got a really strong room here. We've got a really skilled team. And then it's just kind of saying, well, can we come in and try that? I think there's some real opportunities in the power of the room and that ownership to really focus on the positive. So that's been something, as we're, trying to build that continuum of supports. It would be nice if we, had it kind of magically, cataloged a little bit more, but you get kind of within the moment of the meeting. What was really impactful for me was not being here to participate in the last round of meetings in December, because I was working out of another school with us recording them, and for me to sit back and watch the recording and see, the powerful conversations that occurred. Aaron did a phenomenal job of facilitating, and just seeing that powerful conversation as they go through the key issues. Me as a school leader, seeing that is really awesome to go through and see, like, wow, there's some real things that we're hitting here with the strength of the staff.
Well, and it really is honoring, it's really about honoring the expertise that you have in your building.
But I think you've also pointed to, Trevor, that idea that through collaborative response, there's always going to be the next piece to tackle, refine, and especially that continuum of supports. We often have schools saying, we've made our continuum, now what? Well, you're continually making that continuum in a sense, because it's evolving, it's changing. Aaron's attended a PD session and come back with a really great strategy. Okay, well, where does that fit in our continuum? How do we catalog this better? Could we start attaching resources to this so that it just becomes more of a powerful resource to help support the conversations that are happening?
Yeah, and I think we started with building a continuum of supports, and then it didn't really work well. Right? Like, it was like a list of things that teachers do, but it was never really referred to after when we were having discussions, because we didn't really know what its purpose was. So the strategies are there, and right now they're coming out organically. It's not looking at a list that was created a year and a half ago. So at some point, finding using that when the ideas come up in those collaborative team meetings, finding a way to like effectively put those onto the continuum so that it's an organic process as it happens, I think will be more effective than how we try to like, okay, let's make a list of everything we do and then try and figure out which tier it's supposed to be in. And then, okay, now we're done. So we're just going to walk, right? And then it doesn't get used because it just sits either on a wall or on a hard drive or whatever. And it right. So I think that's where we're working right now, is trying to get that continuum of supports to be an organic piece, a tool, because we want to be able to build capacity in our building too, right? And that's kind of the purpose of that continuum of supports, is to get that capacity building so that when you get your new grade 2 teacher or your new grade 6 teacher, these are some strategies we use in math that work for kids. So pick one. And if you don't know how to use that one, your grade partner does, because they were here last year and the year before or whatever, right? So I think that's the hope. But it's definitely, we got some work to do for sure.
Well, and I think, Aaron, too, a couple of things. One, I remember when I shared with you, Kurtis had asked us, hey, is it okay if we borrow your continuum of supports? And do you remember your reaction? You're like, oh my God, really? I don't want anybody seeing that. It's, it's not
terrible. Like, what?
There was that, but for another school, without the context of it, that might be where they're at. The second thing I wanted to just kind of reflect on is at the start of the year, of course, Kurtis, as you know, you joined us in, late August, beginning of September as our group of leaders, and you took us through the process, kind of revisiting the different steps of collaborative response. It was kind of an 8-piece sheet, kind of talking about the different roles as to why these are important roles within a CTM. And it was really great. It was it was literally a jigsaw activity with the hyperlinks within it. It impacted Aaron and I. Were like, oh, boom, for sure we need to run through this with our staff at our first conversation together. And it really made an impact on the staff as to kind of why some of these pieces are so important. And what the follow-up from that is as the staff kind of got together in their groups, they said, hey, I think we would like to have roll cards within our meetings. And I think we would like to try rotating roll. And some of the things that maybe I wouldn't have predicted that they would have wanted to do, they absolutely embraced and were like, no, I think this is important. And I think we should try this. And so then, we're happy to try and incorporate some of those things within. And so, we actually were able to make use of our roll cards within that last set of December CTMs. And I think it's, you've got on the back kind of a reminder of what you're doing within that role. Mm-hmm. The real challenge will be when we start seeing, team members say, hey, you know what, I want to try facilitating a meeting. I want to try some of those other things. And me as a school leader wanting to, maintain that structure and control, because I want it to work well. So then, I have to be able to step back and try a different role within the meeting. So that's what's really exciting as we head into our next round of meetings here in January and February.
And I think a big win we had this year that we weren't expecting was when we made norms for our SST meetings, and our thought was we'll just kind of transfer them down into each group because they should be relatively the same. And when we actually reviewed the norm for the groups, they actually gave some pushback and changed norms, which to me means they're starting to value that part of the process, right? Yeah. Whereas a lot of times you'll get that norm discussion and people will kind of like brush it off and they're like, it's fine, we're professionals.
We don't need norms, we're professionals.
Yeah, exactly. But this one, they were like, well, what does that norm mean? And we don't really like it, and it doesn't really apply to us. So can we change? We should change it. I'm like, yes, we should change it. So all of our collaborative teams have slightly different sets of norms. So our K-2 team, their norm set is different than our 3, 4, 5 team, right? So each team has started to take some ownership over what those meetings look like and the structure, and even the fact that some of them were like, yeah, we can probably facilitate a meeting. We're all open to that. Right. So in our last set, we took the roll cards and we just I put them face down on the desks and they just kind of sat wherever. And some of them peaked and some of them didn't, but at least, right, everybody was at least open to taking a bigger role in the meeting than Trevor and I kind of pushing and driving that meeting forward. So I think that's been a big win this year.
One of the other things too that pleasantly surprised me, I had the opportunity to go out to Buck Mountain School, and I know that you've met with Nicole and Mike York, talking with them, and I had the opportunity to take part in one of their collaborative team meetings on numeracy. And one of the things that they had embedded as part of their meetings is, the pre-meeting organizer, they had decided as a group that actually, instead of trying to scramble and fill it out in advance before the meeting or after school or whatever, and the different pressures that different team members have, they embedded within their meeting, hey, we're going to look at our data, we're going to have this data set, but we're actually going to embed within the start of our meeting time to complete the pre-meeting organizer right in there at the start. And so we put that forward to some of our groups, and not every group decided the same. And we said, okay, well, we could make these meetings a smidge longer. They're actually maybe this one meeting might be an hour every time, because we're going to embed time to do that pre-meeting organizer right off the hop of the meeting, and just kind of quiet work time. And other groups said, actually, no, that's not for me. I need to pick up my child from care or whatever, the day home. And so it's kind of the ownership of the group within the meeting. It's really unique depending on each group, and each one of our 4 collaborative team meetings has their own unique dynamic. And it's really quite fascinating to take in, because they have different areas that they're working in, and the personalities are, they all have their own unique strengths. So it's really quite interesting.
I really love that idea of, we start with an understanding that is largely led by leadership and brought forward, but in time, the ownership becomes within the room. It shifts and evolves. And, it's interesting, Aaron, when you talked about, right now we're at a place of really trying to refine, and we're working on that continuum of supports. I remember about this time last year, the conversation was, we're really trying to work on our data and evidence, and how do we bring that in? Because that's kind of a sticking point for us right now. So, Aaron, I know that I've seen the spreadsheets that have been developed within the school. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about how the data and evidence has evolved within the school, and how it's being used to inform which students and the supports that we're bringing in? And then even in time, how do we know if what we're doing is working, which is really important?
Sure. And it's still evolving and changing, because we all make little mistakes and wish we could do things better. So, but without having some kind of even numerical data or something we could all look at, I felt there was always this tension between identifying students that were almost successful or getting close to being successful, or that needed that extra push, and the kids that were grade levels behind, and needing more than just tier 2 support.
Yeah.
And so and then those CTM meetings would end up being that kind of, well, these kids are really struggling, but they're never here, and they haven't been here for 3 years, and their attendance, like all that stuff kept coming up without and then we're like, well, no, we can't talk about that kid. And then teachers would get frustrated because they tried to bring up a concern, and I just told them they can't bring up that concern. So really shifting and saying, okay, so for this meeting, we're going to look at, so we'd use, whether it was MIPI data or trying to use the STAR data. And part of it is, like, STAR data is relatively new to our school. And so even interpreting what that tool is trying to tell us is work. And there's pushback from teachers, and it's a good discussion so that we can actually get to a point where, like, okay, so this is the part of the data that we can agree is useful. How can we use it to change practice? So that's where we are probably at right now, is you've been able to find some data sets that people can agree there's some value to them. And we're going to look at a specific piece. So even in the MIPI, we're not going to look at the MIPI final average. We're going to look at, okay, these 4 questions on the MIPI were all on place value. So, and these students didn't do well, or didn't do as well as they could have on place value. They didn't get all of them wrong, but they got these ones that were maybe right at the end of, say, grade 3. So they should know it by now because they're in grade 4, right? But it's not, they don't know any of it. They don't know just this part. So how are we going to address this, especially when you go and try and start whatever the grade 4 outcomes are for place value? Before you start that, what can you address with your class, knowing that you're going to target these 2 students? Like, all the class is going to get the instruction, but you're really going to look at these 2 students. How did they do after your tier 2 intervention?
And really making sure that it's focused on, a yellow student. We're not, everyone worries about the students in red. And of course we worry about them, but we're really giving a name and a specific, okay, we're looking, the measurement is based on how did this student do. We're not just intervening just with this one student, but these 2 yellow students, we're going to measure after we've tried this, and we're going to talk about this at this next meeting. So did Jonathan, how did it end up being? You did your sprint, you did your activities that you said you're going to do. What did it look like? How do they do? And then that can kind of shape the conversation. because those 3 other teachers, they also named a student who was struggling with that same specific concept or area of learning that we looked at. Instead of looking at a MIPI as a whole, we're kind of looking, okay, this time we're looking at this subsection. And that's what one of the pieces that I was able to glean from when I attended at Buck Mountain. Yeah, they're using MIPI as their tool, but they're actually looking really specifically just at this chunk of MIPI at that time. So,
well,
yeah.
And I think then that's how it interconnects with your layers of team, because we're not saying we're never going to look at a red. No, there's the right space for that conversation. And in our collaborative team meetings, can we focus on the students that will see the greatest impact from classroom-based adjustments and supports and interventions? And the irony of that is, through doing that, I'm building my skill set, I'm building my toolbox that's going to have impact for all students, particularly our ones that are most at risk. It's just a different way of thinking.
We had a staff meeting earlier in the year talking about what we were going to do with the MIPI and which students we were going to focus on. And we did get some pushback from a couple of teachers, and they were like, well, what are these kids who are really struggling? And we said, well, but you're going to change your classroom instruction. You're going to do something different. And yes, you're looking at how it affects these students that are in yellow, but the whole class is there for the instruction. It's going to influence how the students in red, yellow, and even in green are going to understand that particular topic. So it's not that you're only focusing on those kids and just teaching those 2 kids that you brought up in the meeting. You're still teaching all the kids, and they're all going to benefit, or maybe they won't, depending on what the strategy was. It's possible, right? But you're going to apply a strategy, and all the students are going to experience that strategy, and you'll be able to see if it was effective or not effective. And I thought that, it wasn't quite an aha moment, but it was close. And so I think, right, and even when it comes to collecting the data after, I've left it kind of open, and we've said, well, they're like, okay, how do you plan on showing whether or not the student met the goal of your intervention? So I'm not, if you want, I can provide a tool, but maybe it's just maybe you give 3 questions at the end of the class or at the end of the week, and the goal is, and don't mark all the kids' stuff. You just really want to look at the 2 kids you said you were focusing on. It's not a whole bunch of new work. It's those 2 kids we're going to focus on. Check to see how they did on your exit slip, and that's what you're going to bring back to the next CTM meeting.
Kurtis, at one of our early collaborative response, sessions that we had as leaders, one of the things that you had mentioned has really kind of resonated with me as a school leader is you talked about, the real win for a school principal in having the collaborative response model is when you've got your CTMs. Really what you're impacting is you're actually changing and improving tier 1 instruction using the lens, like the collaborative team meeting is actually getting teachers to reflect and grow and learn from each other. That's your win. And as you kind of shift back, it's not about a meeting, it's about professional structured conversations and really being strength-based. And it's really, as you kind of keep that in your mind as you're, working together with your admin team at the school, it's really quite exciting. And I mean, we keep changing and growing, and sometimes it seems like we're taking steps back. And I mean, honestly, this year we stepped right back in September and early October as we went in, and we just dedicated time to seeing, okay, if we're going to meet together moving forward, what's the ways in which that's going to be effective, and we want that buy-in. And so, it's not necessarily about, how you're doing it per se, it's about the why, so I that's just really stuck with me. And I don't know when you said it might've been 2 years ago, but that's just always been at the forefront for why collaborative response has been impactful. So
well, and we often have schools when they first see that collaborative team meeting go, oh yeah, we talk about kids too, we already do that. But it's really just using the student to leverage a conversation about my practice, and in doing so, it's creating vulnerability. It's creating a space where I can say, I'm not quite sure what to do with this particular key issue. But when others say, oh yeah, I have 2 students that are also struggling with that as well. Okay, well now what could we do? And it just opens the door to that conversation. And we often say that when we can formalize and make that a really structured process, it impacts the informal. collaboration that happens in the school. The conversations start to sound differently when people are in the workroom, staff room, school. Can you speak to that? Have you seen any of that overflow into just the informal collaboration that's happening, that's not planned or structured within the building?
I would say that, like, we've been, as a school district, we've been wanting to really focus in on wellness across our district. And I think if sometimes as administrators, if we're not careful or mindful, we can end up just adding tasks, and it's, becomes task overload. So I think when the collective team, the collaborative team is meeting together and they're valuing what each other has to say, the conversation doesn't have to have a dark cloud over it. It can, people are valuing their time. They want to get there on time. They want to, work together to try and problem solve. So, again, it's still early on seemingly this year, even though it's now January, we haven't had as many meetings yet as we probably would have had in the past. But I think, the pieces are there for us to start to see some more of that momentum build.
Well, and I think, and Trevor can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we were pretty dissatisfied with our collaborative team meetings last year. Like, they were there, we tried to follow the structure, but it didn't feel authentic. It didn't feel like we were getting from our teachers what we really wanted, which is why this year we really kind of, in September, we're like, well, what do we want these meetings to be about? And we used a lot of our collaborative team meeting time to kind of have that kind of open discussion with the teachers in the group and say, okay, how can we make this meeting something that's going to be valued? Because that's the thing that matters most. If teachers aren't valuing the meeting time, then it will be a waste of time regardless of the structure you put into it. So I think if I had advice for other administrators, if you should plan on being dissatisfied with your first collaborative team meetings, they will not be what you want them to be, because there's a learning curve to it, and it's a little steep, but I think there's a value in going through it as opposed to going through 3 or 4 and saying, nope, this isn't for us. You need to go through, you need to see what the structure feels like. You kind of need to see where the pitfalls are, because for each of our groups, it's different, right? Like the strengths and areas of growth in our K-2 team are different than they are in our 3-4 team or in our 5-6 team, right? So trying to teach each group as being the same was probably a mistake. It was a mistake, right? We made a mistake in thinking that each team is gonna, like, these are the steps, this is the structure, we're gonna be fine. But you know what? The pedagogy of this group, they're phenomenal. Their tier 2 is great. In fact, when it comes to having discussions about what students need tier 2 support, they don't even know how to have the conversation because it's almost natural to them. They don't see it as tier 2 support. Whereas in a different group, this is the curriculum. We need to stick to the curriculum. I'm like, well, it doesn't matter if you stick to the curriculum because the kids aren't learning it yet because we haven't figured out how to, right? So each group is going to have its own different supports needed for each group. And so learning what that support is going to be and how you're going to structure your collaborative team meetings takes some time.
Yeah,
but it's worthwhile. I think we still got work to do, but it's a process that I'm invested in for sure.
I appreciate what Aaron just shared there, because it is true. Like, the amount of reflection and conversation that we have together in terms of how did that go? Like, what do you think? Like, man, like, there's some painful parts there. Like, there's some times where it's just silence, and like, it's like, wow, like. So, but then us as leaders, we take that, a lot of ownership in terms of, why isn't it working, or what can we do better? What can we try? And so I definitely appreciate the grace and patience that staff has shown as we've tried to adapt and try to, make things better as we're growing, because you don't want to, have anyone leaving going like, man, that was a waste of time. Like, wow, like, right? Like, that's your biggest fear. Cause I think every professional has sat at some point in their career through a staff meeting like, man, oh man, I just, like, why am I here? And so that, when it's your staff that's saying that, and you are the person who called the meeting, like, that is, you don't want to waste anyone's time. So you want, when you're getting that highly skilled team together, it's got to be effective, and there's got to be buy-in. So
yeah, and we've been really, we've been pretty open with our staff about, you know what, if there's criticism, please bring it forward. Like, and I remember our very first CTM meeting we did get that. That's not what that meeting was about. Like, you said this is going to happen, and that's not what happened at all. We're like, well, okay, we're gonna change things up a little bit. You're right, absolutely right. That's not, yeah, okay.
Well, and we've had a couple, kind of unique situations where we ended up having a couple, like Clear Vista and Gwyn School joined together, and so you're bringing in two different staff and two different, historical, stories that are blending together, where you've got combined grades together, you've got small school, you've got larger school, and as teams kind of gel. So there's been like a number of different things where staff are forced to be responsive and adaptive, and it does definitely wear on different teammates when you're called together to meet in unique circumstances, and everyone's just trying to do their best. So I mean, even again this year, where we've I left the school for a month, and Aaron was principal here, so like there's different situations, of course, that always evolve, and I think it just ends up making the overall team stronger, because you build and you learn from each other. So,
well, I want to shift just a little bit on that idea of learning and evolving, because I know that one of the things that you've been trying to implement as well is that idea of, how do we provide interventions? When does that happen? And I know Jen's ears perked up when she heard numeracy interventions and plan. That's our listeners definitely know that that's a passion area for Jen. So I'm going to turn it to her to ask some questions in regards to your numeracy intervention program.
So you've talked a little bit about the data that you've been collecting in the spreadsheets through the MIPI and your STAR. And I heard the word sprint. So elaborate for me. What's a sprint? How does it come about? Who's doing what when?
So the idea is we're gonna collect some data, find out, and this would be mostly for our students. So our sprints are definitely focused at our students that are requiring extra support. So like pull-out groups out of it, right? So, but we don't want kids out of class forever. Like if you pull a kid out of class in September because they're behind, and they're still pulled out of class for the same block of time every day in June, you're not doing it right. That's right. They either need to be in a specialized program, or you need to change what you're doing because you haven't helped them. So, and you need to know that before the end of the year. So the idea is we collect, right? We use some data piece to collect some information on some students, where they're at. And then those students that are in red, we set a specific goal on a specific skill. So it's not, the goals that we stay away from are, they need more basic facts, or they need to learn their times table. Like that's not the purpose of our pull-out group. If it's year 3 and you're still saying they need to learn their times tables, that's not an intervention anymore, right? They need a different support. So it's being really specific about, okay, so this student needs practice on regrouping. We're going to spend 2 weeks focusing on regrouping, and we should probably have a different instructional tool for that skill as well, because if you just have them learn it the same way they were supposed to learn it in class, you're probably going to get the same result. So it sounds really good, and we're still working on it, and it's by nowhere near perfect, but that's the kind of path we're on. So we try and set like a 14 working day schedule, right? So about three of our 4-day cycles, and then a couple of days to look at data, where we say these kids are in this group for this set of time. This is the skill. This is the person they're working with. And then at the end of that period, we're going to retest them with something, right, on the same skill, and see if there was growth. Because if there was growth, they don't need to be in that sprint anymore. If there isn't growth, or maybe there was some growth, but not enough to actually say they're ready to be, they had that skill mastered. Okay, so now we're going to have them in another sprint where they get to practice on this more specific part. Like the idea is we want to know exactly what they're missing, so we can address that skill, as opposed to they just don't get, or they're not like when I hear that kids aren't math kids, it drives me nuts, because that's not a thing, right? So let's just not say they can't do it, right? Which skill are they struggling with, and how can we support them to learn it? That's the goal of our sprints.
Aaron, one of the things that I appreciate about kind of the leadership that you've shown as you've come to Clear Vista is you've really done a great job of challenging our team to have in place a pre and a post. Like when we're heading into an intervention group, we will have a pre-test. And if we can't make it as individuals, then you know what? We'll get the support to do it. Most of the time it ends up being Aaron is willing and he's offering up, hey, I'll design a quick pre-test. And Aaron is a phenomenal math teacher, and he hates when I say that, so I love saying it because it's true, but he's just humble and he won't admit it. And so one of the things that we were able to put together is, because of our data collection last year, we were able to kind of share back to here's why data matters, because we could take from some of our sprints that we did in grade 2 and grade 3 through learning loss, and we were able to say, like, wow, here's where this group of students was, and we within our school, we know the names of the kids, and we could look at, okay, here's how they did on the MIPI, here's how they did on this pre-test, this post-test, here's how they did on our WRPS Common Math Final, and we could kind of show, here's all of the data together, and here's kind of what it looks like, and here's why. And we were able to show that when you have intervention groups that have a common purpose, not just the intervention group purposes, well, the kid's probably behind, but they're behind specifically in this, and this is what we're going to work on. I think that Aaron did a phenomenal job leading in terms of just having what the data measures are going to be and the kind of that follow through. So using a sprint template with, here's our goal, here's our strategies and action steps, who's responsible, what's the timeline, and how are we going to know that we were successful? Just kind of following that sprint model. So Aaron will never admit that he did a phenomenal job in that, but it's really quite.
And it's never at where we want it to be either, because there's always things that are going to slow down the pace of how quickly you want to get things done. So especially like this year, at the beginning of the year, there was a lot of people out because of sickness, right? There's like 3 viruses going around. And so like you have teachers missing and kids missing. And so even trying to collect the data in a way that feels timely is sometimes tough to do. But the other part is, like, our first real numeracy sprint is starting this week, even though I would have rather it started in November, but it wasn't just meant to be. But it's not, right? So we're not giving up on those sprints. It's just, okay, we finally had a spot where we have people ready to do it, and we know which kids are going to be. And is it unfortunate that it's 2 months behind? Sure, but we're still going to do it and go through that process because it's a good process. And next September, we're going to start it, like, we're going to try it again because we saw results last year, right? So restarting or changing intervention schemes or plans, or doing the new thing because the last thing didn't work the first time through is not an effective way to do things, right? Well, so we want to do something, we want to learn from mistakes, and then we want to try it again.
And Aaron, I think by nature, all of our educational assistants and our teachers within the school, they're getting up every morning because they want to help and they want to impact students, and they're really good at what they do. So of course, they want to just hit the ground running. Like, how quickly can we get started? We need to intervene. We need to get going now. So, when we put some parameters around what that might and could look like, sometimes that can kind of be faced with a little bit of resistance, because it's like, Trevor, Aaron, what's wrong with you guys? Like, we got to intervene, like, right now, we got to get going. And it's not saying that we don't do that, but it's just when we're trying to frame it within that lens, so that we can kind of, see what's effective and really dial in for moving forward in the future as to what is working well, what is actually needed. It's more than just number sense. It's a little bit, we can drill down a bit more with that.
And I mean, we started doing sprints last year, and one of the first things, and we had some teachers leading some of the sprints, and one of their first concerns was, well, what happens if it doesn't go well? What does that say about me? I'm like, no, this isn't about your teaching. It's about their learning. We want to see if what they're learning and if it was effective, and if it wasn't, we'll adapt. It's right. And I had a teacher come to me and say, well, this one student, they've missed like 4 days and they're like way behind everybody else, or the sprint was aimed at, it started off, it was a literacy sprint. And I want to say it started off with learning, and my Div 1 literacy vocabulary is not very good, being a math, but it was about letter blends or something, right? So they were supposed to be learning letter blends, and like the group was like a group of, they were already identified as being way below letter blends. It was they're learning letter names and individual letters. And it's like, but they're not gonna pass that post test. I'm like, that's okay, right? We already said the post test was going to be this, and they're going to do that, and we're going to see how much growth there was. Maybe they got 2 out of 10 or 2 out of 20 the first time through, and maybe they're getting 6 out of 20 the next time through, and that's okay. It shows that there was growth, and yes, they're still going to get more intervention. It's just, we don't change the post test just because we think the kids didn't learn the stuff. That defeats the purpose of it.
I'm sure our audience has a ton of questions for you guys around who's in your groups. Are they multi-graded? How many kids? What are your things? So your contact information will be in the description of this episode.
You can redirect all the questions to Trevor. It'll be fine.
My email address is aaron.weimer.
But you two are incredibly reflective educational leaders. You can tell that it comes through in the conversations that you're having and just the way you describe the process. So I have a question for you.
This question is brought to you by WeCollab. Designed by educators for educators, this comprehensive digital system aligns with the foundational components of collaborative response. Moving from conversation to action, WeCollab empowers classrooms, schools, and systems to provide the very best response for each and every child by informing action-based decision-making with data and evidence supporting student success.
If you could go back to your past self who was just starting the implementation of collaborative response, what advice would you give yourself?
Probably slow down. You have to go slow. And, I'm a competitive person, and I want, my school to be reflected well. I want my team to be reflected well. And so sometimes, you want to show progress, but maybe in the desire to move really fast, you're ending up having to circle back, and that's okay. So I would say just going slow, because the learning is through the process of it. We kind of want to just say, well, that school has that, and we'll just kind of take that piece and we'll just do that. Well, the reason why it works for that school is because of the process, that the journey that they took together to make it there. And so I think in the long run, taking things slowly, you're going to, to get more beneficial results by actually just slowing it down. And so that's been a lifelong challenge for myself. Like, I want to let's just go, but let's finish the project properly. Perhaps my wife would have some thoughts on that as we've gone projects around it.
Aaron, what advice are you giving yourself?
I think you have to be okay with setbacks. I think that's the biggest thing, right? You don't nothing is going to go as smoothly as you want the first time through, and you are going to make mistakes. It's unfortunate but true. Mistakes happen. So patience and perseverance, and just knowing that it's going to take some work to get it done right, but the goal is lasting change, not that kind of there's no easy fix. There's no instant way to change things that you want improvement with. And also, we're looking at it's small steps of progress too that make a big change. We're not looking for a massive change right now. Teachers do a good job with the students in their classroom. That's not the purpose of implementing collaborative response. It isn't to make terrible teachers better. It's a way of supporting staff, and our staff, they already do a great job. Our teachers do a great job. Our EAs do a great job. They are invested in seeing students learn, and we're just wanting to help that. So that's really making so you don't have to go fast.
Right. Well, and I've said through this work as well, that is it going to mean less work for our individuals in the building? No, probably not. Everyone, like Trevor, when you said, people wake up and they want to make a difference, and by very nature in this profession, we work hard because we want to see students succeed. Yeah. So we're probably not going to reduce the workload, but what we are going to do is increase the impact of that work. And when we can see more students having success due to our efforts, that's really, really gratifying for us, I think, and understanding that doesn't happen with quick fixes, and it doesn't happen with assumptions of less than impactful process or practice. It comes from assuming good things are happening, and how do we really leverage those effectively to collaboratively respond to the needs of our students.
If there's an effective instructional practice, having each teacher find it on their own isn't the most effective use of our time, right? Like if there's something that's a gem in terms of how to instruct, and it really works, especially helping those kids that need some extra support, sharing that out in your staff as quickly as possible so others can try it is the best way to support students, as opposed to me trying 8 things before I get to that one thing that I could have learned from my neighbor years ago, right?
Well, gentlemen, I know your students are probably missing you in your hallways so that you can go greet them. Trevor, I always enjoy talking to you because you speak so eloquently about collaborative response, and your understanding is incredibly deep. It's very nice to be reconnected with Aaron because it's been a number of years. So it's exciting to know that former colleagues as students are now experiencing success as educational leaders. So that's been great. So thank you very much both for your time. And we look forward to hearing more stories from Clear Vista School.
Ensuring success for all students is a moral imperative for all schools, but it takes a highly coordinated framework of structures and processes to maximize the collective capacity of the team.
In collaborative response, 3 foundational components that transform how we respond to the needs of learners, we share an organizational mindset that involves fundamental shifts for schools and districts.
Numerous school and district examples, as well as access to a large number of resources, are provided within the text and in the accompanying companion website.
Join the growing number of schools using collaborative response to ensure high levels of success for students and staff, stemming from the essential belief that every child deserves a team.
I absolutely love, and it's come now in 2 different conversations that we've had with the educational leaders in Westaskiwin Regional, of understanding the idea of it's a process and that it's ongoing. I love when Aaron said it's never going to be at where you want it to be. There's always going to be that next refinement, that next step. And when he said, expect to be dissatisfied, boy, that's some really powerful advice for people, especially starting off on this journey, to understand that don't expect perfection, especially when you're starting out. Yeah. Expect that there's going to be bumps. It's a journey, and you learn through the process. That really came out from Trevor and Aaron, I think.
Yeah, and that dissatisfaction, like the way that he stated, you expect to be dissatisfied.
Yeah,
but
I love that.
But that idea of being dissatisfied in the initial work comes from that fact that sometimes we jump into this work through activity. So it's through the activity of designing your initial continuum of supports, which he also talked about being dissatisfied with, and the activity of creating your meeting time, and this is the structure of your meeting, and here are the rules. Like that activity piece is it's always the first step for people. It's usually where they begin, but not truly understanding the why behind it, and why do we have rules, and why do we develop that continuum, and why do we continue to revise and adapt that continuum. That only comes when you begin to understand the why of what we're doing through collaborative response.
And I think coming from Aaron and Trevor, as well as Mike and Nicole, that notion of shared ownership. So they talked about guiding coalitions at the district level. They talked about how they're establishing feedback from their staff of, going through the process and, being willing to accept that isn't what you said this meeting was going to do, right? So allowing people to buy into the process through that feedback and then sharing the ownership of that through those roles, through the development of the norms, through the refinement of those norms, because they are not set in stone, I think brings people to that place of this really is about our learning and our students.
Yeah. And you know what, Jen, even through that too, is nurturing that growth mindset. I could hear that in
Absolutely.
every conversation that they were having, whether it was about a student or whether it's about staff or even their own leadership.
Or the process itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Just really focusing in on, how do we identify growth and how do we take those next steps to grow in our learning, but for students as well.
And Jen, we've talked about this before too, of the fidelity of the process, and people, when they first come in saying, well, I like this piece, but I don't like this. This seems a little awkward, or this will be an easy sell on my staff, but this other piece I don't really want to do because I think it's going to be a little bit disruptive. But they talked right off the start about we wanted to have fidelity to the process. We wanted to set up those 4 layers the way they were described, and then know that we can make adjustments, we can make refinements. But the idea, and I think it was Trevor that said, we can't just take something from another school and plop it into our environment, because the reason that's working there is because of the process that they went through in the design. So I love the understanding that there's a fidelity to the process of collaborative response. And you can't, I think it was Mike York from Buck Mountain that had said, you can't take shortcuts within it. You have to live through it. And then, as Trevor said, understanding that you may have to live through that slowly, slow down and understand the process and the learning. Even though they talk about their sprints, this work is not a sprint.
The sprints are a smaller part of a marathon because it's about lasting change.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Another thing that really stood out to me in this conversation was their very intentional and purposeful use of data.
Yes.
And how they are looking at not just averages, not just the global understanding of what they're gathering through that data, but very specific strategies, digging right down to very specific strategies and the needs of students around very even minute skills that they're using then to drive their intervention time.
But wasn't that just readily apparent? The idea that our data, especially when they talked about the color coding of it, how it can then inform their different layers of conversation that they have. And when you introduce the data, now it can start a different conversation. Instead of it's every time we come together, it's the same student surfacing over and over who does need complex support. Well, that actually belongs within this layer that we've built in our collaborative structures and processes.
And I think about, and we often, when we start to talk about those 4 layers of teams, we talk about how most often schools will have teams that are coming together to look at curriculum and their classroom practice at that tier 1.
Collaborative plan.
And those more complex students and the crisis situations, we have tons of support around our school support team and our case consult. But without having our collaborative team meetings and the focus on students who are falling within that yellow, we have a very big gap, and we are having students fall through. We don't have a team if we don't have that collaborative team meeting to attend to the needs of students who are just slightly below, and using the data to identify those students.
And then using that conversation to really build upon practice and share pedagogy and really look at, so what can we do before that student slips further and now it is a crisis, or it is a complex conversation that's, in a sense, we've almost helped create.
Well, and this comes directly back to our statement of every child deserves a team.
Mhm.
And without those collaborative team meetings and without the identification of students who fall within that yellow category, we don't have a team for every child.
You know, collaborative response is that connection between PLCs and RTI.
Mhm.
I'm going to borrow what Aaron said about the idea of impacting instructional practice by focusing on the data. If we are looking at what supports we can put in place for those students at the yellow, we're actually going to be positively impacting students in the red as well as we
Mhm.
change our instructional practice. That focus on the fidelity of the meetings at the different layers and the fidelity of their interventions with the pre-assessment, the post-assessment as part of their sprints. There is integrity in the work that they are doing. Going into that with that growth mindset and desire for shared ownership. That vulnerability of recognizing that we're going to make mistakes and that's okay because that's how we learn.
Yeah, and being forthright with that right off with our staff.
And actually,
So
we learn
powerful.
more from our mistakes than we do from our successes anyway.
Yeah.
We absolutely do. So thank you both for summarizing that with me. I love these conversations. And it was so
Yeah,
nice to
absolutely.
reconnect with
too.
someone I went to school with.
That's cool.
Excellent. All right. Well, we'll look forward to the next opportunity that we have to put the pieces together with other school leaders and continue this rich learning. Thank you so much for all your coordination, Jen.
For more on collaborative response, visit jigsawlearning.ca or join the JL Insider to receive access to newly added resources and content. Make sure to follow us on social media, subscribe to the podcast and the Jigsaw Learning YouTube channel to access past and upcoming episodes. Join us again for more conversations about establishing, refining, and deepening collaborative response.